Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Cato Institute. My name is Chip Bishop. I'm the Director of Student Programs here. It's great to see so many of you here, and you might feel the pressure, but we have a couple hundred people upstairs also watching in the building, so that's pretty awesome. Welcome to Cato. This is part of our new facility, which we opened just earlier this year. I hope you enjoy it. I hope it meets all your needs, and you enjoy the really comfortable seats. Cato, we're a think tank, a public policy research institute, and we work to bring ideas into public action by researching them and advocating that research around. And we have a lot of programs specifically targeting the younger demographics, the future, if you will. And that's what this event stems out of, is the idea that we need to take these ideas and make them personal, and that we need to debate them, and that we need to come to conclusions to advance the country and the society in directions that it should go. Here at Cato, we advocate ideas that should be useful politically, personally, and academically. Many of you are in grad school, undergraduates. A lot of our research that you can use to support in those papers, and you can also intern here at the Cato Institute. I'd like to also take this time to thank our friends at the Heritage Foundation. They have a wonderful Young Leaders program, another great think tank just down the street. I hope that you will check out their facilities and attend their events. I have enjoyed working with them to put this event together. We've got some excellent panelists on both sides, and for this event, I'm really hoping that we're able to focus not just on the differences and the infighting, but also a lot of the similarities that we have together. A portion of today's debate, which our moderator will introduce, is an appeal to the other side on why really they should adopt their core beliefs and come to a different conclusion. So I really hope that this discussion will continue on. We have about an hour-long reception after this, so I hope that the debate is not just consumption, but it's also generation and prompting for you to go have this debate, not just here at Cato for the rest of the evening, but out into the rest of society for the rest of the week. I have the great pleasure of introducing tonight's moderator, who's Tim Carney. He is a senior political columnist for the Washington Examiner. He has columns, you might have seen it. I pick up the paper every day when I go to the Metro, and every Monday and Thursday I read his column. And it really encourages me that someone's out there, putting forth these ideas, but it's also discouraging because he always has things to write about in this city. So it's kind of a pro and con. He's also an MSNBC contributor, and he's the author of 2 books, The Big Ripoff, How Big Business and Big Government Steal Your Money, which won the Templeton Enterprise Award from ISI, and also the Best Book on Liberty by Laissez-Faire Books. His most recent book is Obamonomics. So I hope you'll check both of those out. He is a Bob Novak prodigy, and he personally identifies as both a libertarian and a conservative. He really brings these ideas to home. He'll introduce himself a little bit more, so I won't spoil that for you, but it's a real pleasure to have him here. And please help me welcome Tim Carney.
Thank you, Chip. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I think the question for tonight about which is a better political philosophy is a bit of a question beggar itself. Is conservatism, is libertarianism a political philosophy? Is it a philosophy? Are either of them, should they be called ideologies? Sometimes conservatism gets called a disposition. Sometimes libertarianism gets siloed to simply questions of Washington policy. But maybe these things, both of these philosophies, or one, is rooted in deep principles that are a priori principles, or maybe sort of principles formed through experience. I think some of the underlying issues about what does either presume or say about human nature can be fleshed out in what we're going to talk to about tonight, which some of it is going to be grounded in the philosophy or the ideology or the disposition, and some of it is going to be grounded in specific policy matters, where the gears sort of hit of these ideas and affecting people's lives. And I, as they said, I identify myself as both. There's an old term, fusionist. It was decades ago before. Right now, I kind of think, as much as we talk about these differences, the words Cato and heritage get spit out as a pair very frequently. A lot of times to contrast it, but that they're put together. The words sort of Cato and Center for American Progress don't get spit out as a pair. People don't talk, if they talk about Reason Magazine and National Review, they don't go and say, well, you know, what National Review and the New Republic say. No, the libertarians and the conservatives, however much their differences, kind of end up in the same world. And that, a lot of people argue, is a historical accident. That's one of the things I think we'll get at tonight is, are these sides together just because both sides were fighting against communism back in the day? Or, as the fusionists argued back decades ago, is there some deep philosophical underpinning connecting them? And if so, where does the divide come from? I really hope we'll get at some of those questions tonight. In addressing the divide, there's always a question of, a lot of you probably know the answer to this one, of how many libertarians does it take to change a light bulb? Don't worry, the market will take care of it. And how many conservatives does it take to change a light bulb? Change. Then of course there is a how many neoconservatives does it take to screw in a light bulb? And the answer to that is, don't be so anti-Semitic. But and I, as a conservative libertarian, and you might guess not a neoconservative, I often encounter trouble. I tell people I'm often the libertarian in my conservative crowds and the conservative in my libertarian crowds. It's a contrarianness that probably I shouldn't revel in so much, but I've had both sides sort of tell me not to identify either with them or with the other side. I worked with a very nice lady, Kathleen, in my old job when I was working for Bob Novak, and I described myself as a libertarian once in a radio interview in the office, and when I got off, she said, Tim, come on. Don't describe yourself as a libertarian. I know you. You're a good boy. You go to Mass every week. You believe in God. And the funny thing is that it was the same answer I got from a libertarian who once said, Tim, I know you don't describe yourself as a libertarian. You're a good boy. You go to Mass and you believe in God. So, and I've had the conservatives tell me I'm not a real conservative for some of the views I hold. Again, I think we get at this through addressing what some of the underlying ideas are and what some of the positions are. Though Gene Healy of Cato probably, just so that full disclosure, you know where I'm coming from, the way he described me was, I'm a libertarian from 9 to 5, and after work I go home and be a conservative with my wife and my 4 kids. I think, though, that it runs deeper, the similarities. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe what we'll decide tonight is that the similarities don't run that deeply. Maybe we'll decide that this is just an old marriage of convenience and that the love is lost. So a note to the participants here. From Heritage we have Keith Neely and Maura Kremen, and from Cato we have Matt Cavadon and Jack Soloway. And for you guys, this is a friendly debate. There's high stakes in this debate. The stakes are the souls of the 400 people listening here. You don't want there to be 400, crazy conservative statists running around, and you have to worry about the immortal souls of these people. And so we're going to conduct this very politely. There will be no interrupting. There will be no ad hominem. There will be no name calling. I've asked them also to not be engaging in personalities even outside the room. What one so-called conservative or so-called libertarian did that betrayed his principles isn't relevant to talking about the ideas and the political philosophies. There will be taking turns. This will be a more structured debate than you might be used to. We're going to start off with opening statements, 2 from each side basically, and then go straight into the topics where there will be, for instance, on the, just to make sure I'm getting this exact order right, on the first topic, Heritage will make an opening statement followed by a Cato opening statement. Now, so that you don't get confused, if you think about it the way the rebuttals are going to work, it would be unfair then to have Heritage only have, 5 seconds to prepare their rebuttal. So the first topic will go Heritage, Cato, and then the rebuttals will go Cato, Heritage. And then they'll reverse for later topics. There will basically be 5 rounds: the intros, the policy topics, There will be sort of the attempts to convert the unwashed is the following round. Then questions and answer, and I'll have more guidance for you guys on that, followed by conclusion remarks. And then, of course, the sixth round, as Chip said, we hope that the discussion continues just as peacefully out there during the reception. So I am going to now turn it over. We had a coin flip, and the introductory remarks. Heritage will get to go first, so there you go. And everybody, please welcome our participants and thank them.
So I'd like to thank you to McCartney for introducing us, and thank you to Cato for hosting this event. We very much appreciate it. We are here tonight to debate a question which is becoming increasingly relevant in our national political discourse. Which is the better philosophy, conservatism or libertarianism? In many ways, conservatives and libertarians are natural allies. Both advocate for free markets, limited governments, and private property. We support many of the same policies like low taxes and gun rights. We oppose many of the same policies such as Obamacare and the welfare state. However, we are fundamentally different in our ideas of American government. Whereas conservatives embrace a society based on ordered liberty, firmly grounded in the reality of human nature, libertarians prefer to base their beliefs off of a fantastic ideal of a humanity that is capable of functioning in society with absolute license. Whereas conservatives believe that the blessings of liberty belong not only to ourselves, but to our posterity, libertarians are only concerned with the restrictions of today and give no thought as to how their actions are going to affect future generations. Ultimately, as we will see, there is no debate and no doubt as to which of the two sets of ideas represented in this room is inherently superior. First and foremost, let's look a little bit more closely at some of the key tenets of libertarianism. To libertarians, the individual is the only unit in society that truly matters. Milton Friedman defined libertarianism as promoting the maximum freedom for each individual, provided that he did not interfere with the liberty of others. Libertarians then treat each individual as a complete and independent entity that functions in his own distinct sphere. While respect for the individual is very important, we certainly would not contest that, this notion also completely ignores the reality of human beings' very social relationship with others. Furthermore, libertarians argue that the free market should be the basis for absolutely everything, from the border to the bedroom. Conservatives would agree that the free market is great. We love it. We want more of it. But there are places where it doesn't work, as they are public goods. Defense, law enforcement, and public infrastructure are a few examples of things that the free market is simply not equipped to provide. And as a result, there is a need for government. And this is where libertarianism starts to run into some real philosophical dilemmas. To paraphrase the libertarian philosopher Murray Rothbard, if you concede that it is legitimate for people to band together and allow the state to force individuals to pay taxes for a certain service, he uses the example of defense, why is it not then equally moral and legitimate for people to band together and allow the state to provide any of a number of other services? If libertarians were to be entirely consistent in these beliefs, they would really need to be anarchists. Conservatives, on the other hand, embrace a coherent and consistent worldview that is also fundamentally in line with the realities of human nature. As William Buckley once said, conservatism is the politics of reality. It is for this reason that, while conservatives do view the individual as the most basic unit of society, we also respect that there are other institutions which are critical to a functioning civilization, such as the family, the community, religious groups, businesses, and educational institutions. Humans are social animals, and the groups in which we meet and interact as much a part of the human experience as is the individual. It is for this reason that we leave Locke's state of nature and establish governments in the first place. Conservatism accepts the necessity of government and seeks to create one adequate to the reality of America's status as a great power in a globalized world. This means strong national defense, border security, and well-maintained infrastructure, among other things. But conservatives have an additional goal in mind: securing the blessings of liberty not only to ourselves, but to our posterity. This requires an ordered liberty that can last, not the unrestricted license of libertarianism. It necessitates a support of the structures that create a virtuous citizenry, such as educational and religious institutions, and above all, the family. Conservatives live in the real world, the world of human nature, and it is around that we shape our philosophies of government. Ultimately, while conservatives and libertarians can agree on many things, we are fundamentally different in our philosophies. Libertarians believe that society can function on the basis of individuals being able to do whatever they want, provided that they don't hurt others, of course. Government has no place imposing any restrictions on anyone because to do so would be to interfere with their liberty. This is a lovely thought and has made for some very interesting utopian novels. Unfortunately, we don't live in a utopia. We live in the world of imperfect human beings that must function outside the sphere of the individual. As James Madison once said, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary." Conservatism works within the bounds of that reality. We believe in a government that is controlled and limited in order to secure our liberty, and we believe that there is a role in such a government to order our liberty in order to ensure that it exists for the future. At the end of the day, not only is conservatism the inherently superior philosophy in this debate, it is the only viable alternative America has to the statism of the left, for only conservatism provides the framework for a lasting government of free men. Thank you.
Thank you. And now for 5 minutes of their opening statement, we have Jack Soloway from Cato.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming tonight. Thank you to our fellow interns at Cato. Preparation for this event was truly a group effort. And thank you to Keith and Maura from the Heritage Foundation for engaging with us in what Milton Friedman called the ultimate end: voluntary cooperation and free discussion. Free discussion and voluntary cooperation drive the libertarian social order. In this libertarian order, individuals have the right and the responsibility to make decisions about their own lives. We argue that this order is both the most moral and the most productive political system. Now, free discussion does not just mean the debate in Congress that precedes a law telling you what you can or can't do. Rather, it means private citizens negotiating prices in the market, spreading the word that they hold as truth, and sharing their scientific findings. Similarly, voluntary cooperation does not mean pitching in at a soup kitchen on Sunday and then being forced by the Department of Health and Human Services to buy contraception that violates your freedom of conscience on Monday. Rather, voluntary cooperation means having the freedom to choose the goods, services, and values that you demand every day. Free discussion and voluntary cooperation are moral principles. They allow us to live as we are born and as we wish to continue. They are also practical principles. They allow people to exchange goods, services, and ideas, and thereby produce and learn more together than we ever could alone. Libertarians and conservatives agree that free markets, in which people can engage in mutually beneficial exchanges, make everyone better off. We agree that government intervention in the economy makes no one except for the government and its cronies better off. Libertarians and conservatives also agree with James Madison when he wrote in Federalist 51, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary." We agree that men and women are not angels. We both know that there are people inside and outside of our borders that wish to gain money and influence, not by reason and work, but through violence and theft. Therefore, a justice system that safeguards our rights to life, liberty, and property is necessary. So too is the military, which provides the indivisible good of national defense. Here, however, is where we see the first area of disagreement between libertarians and conservatives. While libertarians maintain that national defense should be limited to those military actions that actually protect our security, conservatives argue that we should use the military to build other nations. Libertarians and conservatives alike want to see liberty spread throughout the world. But libertarians know it's impossible to spread liberty through coercion and violence. Conservatives themselves argue that culture and virtue must precede limited government. It is therefore prudent to engage in free trade and not prolonged conflicts with other nations around the world. Specifically, conservatives and libertarians, furthermore, while conservatives and libertarians both understand that the invisible hand works in the market of goods, giving us the most productive businesses, conservatives selectively ignore the fact that this invisible hand also works in the market of ideas, providing us with the most effective institutions. Specifically, conservatives worry that the institutions they value, such as religion and virtue, are threatened by competition in the marketplace of ideas. They therefore advocate the same government action to protect these ideas, which they rightly reject when it comes to commerce. Conservatives argue for government support of religion. They argue for prohibition of drug use, which they deem a depraved activity. Libertarians encourage conservatives to have more faith in the value of their own beliefs. We argue that religion and virtue can thrive without the force of the state. In fact, we argue that state support for religion and for enforcing virtue is counterproductive. Libertarians observe that free people direct their resources, time, and energy to the things they actually value. We reason that the things people value will flourish to the extent that those things allow the people to flourish. We maintain that if these things don't allow the people themselves to flourish, then they weren't very good ideas in the first place. We argue that good ideas spread by their own merit. We think that many conservative ideas have merit and are valuable. We think that hardworking and loving families prosper. We think that religions do wonderful work in society, spreading education, wisdom, and charity. We are confident that this work does not go unnoticed, and that these institutions generate and house ideas that will thrive by their own merit. Libertarians argue, if you love it, set it free. We love society, we love its institutions, we love its individuals, its religions, its schools. We argue that it should be set free. Thank you.
Quick question. Does anyone know what James Madison said about... Never mind. From Heritage, Keith Neely. Keith, assuming you wave this at you when you've got 30 seconds left.
30 seconds?
What? When you have 30 seconds left. You have 3 minutes.
30 seconds would have been somewhat of a shock, I'm afraid. My opponents open with a beautiful picture of libertarianism, a world of free discussion and voluntary cooperation. A beautiful idea, I must admit, if, of course, such a society has existed, could exist, would exist, or could possibly survive on its own. This is the ultimate problem, isn't it? We both agree these ideas are great ideas. Liberty is something worth protecting. But, as in all things, sometimes to protect liberty, it does need to be checked. Our founders themselves recognized this. If one principle endures from the founding to the present day, it's that all things need to be checked. Government power needs to be checked. That's why we have separate branches with checks and balances. But to that end as well, even great pure ideas like liberty need to be checked if they are to survive. And that's a central concept, a central idea that libertarians in particular seem to miss. My opponent also uses the phenomenal quote, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary," and then calls and looks to the justice system to solve this discrepancy. The justice system, yes, is part of the tool, but it's more than that, isn't it? We live in a world today, less than a month ago, in which the justice system failed us, didn't it? In which the justice system, by all degrees, upheld a law that I think we both agree is wrong, a law that we both agree is an overstep of constitutional bounds, but this is the same justice system that you feel comfortable enough to rely upon to overcome the very foundation of human nature, that men aren't angels. We require more than simple institutions, more than simple justice. We do require virtue. And to that end, I think we do disagree, and we will get to thread that out further over the course of the debate. You also paint kind of, I have to say, a false depiction of conservatism, at least when it comes to military defense. I think few conservatives, or at least few conservatives here, would argue that the United States ought to use its military forces to build freedom around the world. We are not a nation solely devoted to building liberty. But building liberty is one of the ideas that we care about. Not through force, no. But when our national defense requires it, we will step forward and carry a burden. They also have this convoluted notion that we believe in some kind of state-established religion, pushing the support of religion. We do believe that the state does benefit from the existence of religion, but that's not a new idea. It's an idea that's persisted for hundreds of years. It was an idea that our founders valued. From the very beginning and the very origins of our nation, the idea that religion was a beneficial force upon society was not an abstract one. It was very much a real one. And I think that's something we need to carry forward in the debate, that there is a middle ground, so to speak, an idea where the state can encourage the existence of religion without mandating one or establishing one, and that's something we need to consider. In closing, there are lots of differences. We've had a chance to articulate them today, and I look forward to spending more time throughout the course of this debate. Thank you.
Everyone's doing a very good job of staying on time. I hope that we'll keep this up. And from Cato, Matt Cavadon.
Good evening, folks, and thanks for coming out here on a stormy Wednesday evening. My name is Matt Cavadon, and I'm an intern at the Cato Center for Constitutional Studies. More importantly than that, I'm the son of a police officer. I'm the grandson of 2 veterans. I would like to believe that a part of my legacy that I've been born into is a love for liberty, which at least Pache Keith seems to be another idea that has survived from the Revolution. I'm also a Catholic. I study law and theology at Emory University. I consider myself a libertarian, not a libertine. I certainly don't think of myself as an atomist. I don't believe that the individual is the only institution in society that matters. I've been to some great universities. I'm a part of what I believe is the universal church, and I've got a great family. I consider myself a libertarian because I believe in the value of conserving these things. Conservatives and libertarians, like Maura said, share some common values. We both believe in the rule of law and in stable institutions that set the framework for a good life together. You know, you folks talked about absolute license. When I look over at Europe, at the riots in the United Kingdom and in Greece, I see an unhealthy society that's indulging in absolute license, disregarding law, disregarding property, and really indulging in rage. Libertarians stand against that too. Where we differ with conservatives is that we question whether conservatives are primarily about conserving our constitutional order today, or whether you folks are perhaps a little more interested in conserving the legacy of Woodrow Wilson. Let's talk about it for a minute. We've talked about prudence, we've heard talk about virtue, and we've heard talk about community. But it seems like at least the conservatives who've held power lately have spent billions of dollars locking people up for drug use on public health grounds. They have funded the Pentagon and global military engagements, several of which we're still embroiled in today. Although I'm glad to hear that the conservatives in this room might not think that's as wise as the ones who seem to be outside of this room. Conservatives also have consistently supported immigrations and custom raids in small towns throughout this country, pulling apart some of the families and communities that, like ours a century ago, are building this country's future. These policies aren't prudent. They're not proportionate to public needs. They do not turn the law into a source of motivation for virtue. Rather, they turn it into an occasion for fear. These policies undermine communities through arrests. This isn't the virtue, prudence, and community that I believe in conserving. So let's come together tonight. Let's reason together, as the prophet Isaiah put it, and let's ask if more liberty might not be a better way to enjoy the blessings of liberty and to honor our American heritage. Thank you.
All right, excellent. We are now moving into the actual policy topics. Again, it will be 2-minute opening statements by one side, followed by a 2-minute opening statement by the other. 1-minute rebuttal by the other side, followed by a 1-minute rebuttal by the one. So as I have this written down, Heritage gets to go first, and then again fourth on this topic. The resolution is that all drugs should be legalized. So 2 minutes, and they're going to do it from here. And we don't have sort of a guy in the Chip is in the front. You have your timepiece there. So Chip's a timekeeper. Anybody who violates time gets a stern rebuke, and if there's a second violation, they will be penalized by a punishment determined by me. So Heritage, have at it.
Wonderful. We get to open with the most exciting issue, I think, kind of anticlimactic, unfortunately. So, should all drugs be legalized? Before we answer this question in full, I'd kind of like to engage in a thought experiment with the crowd. We're going to walk away from the traditional understanding of drug legalization, at least as I think my generation understands it most, the idea of a teenager smoking pot in his parents' basement. And we're going to walk in a different direction. We're going to go on a journey, if you will. We're going to walk to the poorest neighborhood in Washington, D.C., where instead of 17-year-olds smoking pot, we see families completely destroyed, individuals utterly annihilated by the use of hard drugs. Heroin, crack cocaine, PCP, ecstasy, the list can go on and on. The point being is that we have examples here in the United States today of the very thing that libertarians, I believe, can't possibly accept, and it's the idea that some drugs, and in particular hard drugs, are drugs that cannot be used responsibly, and that in this case the extension of liberty only, in fact, results in its curbing. Because if we think about it, what at the end of the day is a man addicted to drugs? Is he truly free? Is a man that's addicted to heroin truly a free individual, capable of practicing his political liberties, his religious liberties? Not at all. Now let me do one more thing. I only have 2 minutes, so I apologize for the curtness. But let's also distinguish here between the idea that drugs, or some drugs, should be illegal and the war on drugs. They're two very, very different things. I think conservatives can agree that the current war on drugs, in many capacities, is a failure. And there does need to be reform. But that does not mean that the idea, in principle, that drugs need to be made illegal, some drugs, that does not mean that that principle is in itself invalid. So do not let my opponents merely launch an attack against the war on drugs. That, in and of itself, is a failed attack. Look instead to the idea of whether or not some drugs can be used responsibly, or if, as I believe, they only curb the liberty of the individual further. Thank you.
Well done. Good job staying within the time. Cato, 2 minutes.
I would like to take you on a slightly different journey this evening. Tonight, 40 years after President Nixon declared a federal war on drugs, 1 in 100 Americans are in prison. 1 in 28 children in this country has a parent in prison. Let's take a walk to the jails where those people are serving. They aren't with their families. They aren't in their communities. Oh yes, families and communities have been destroyed by drugs, and also by drug prohibition. 25% of the people in our prisons are in jail for nonviolent offenses, drug offenses. Millions of people, meanwhile, are still addicted in the streets, as Keith pointed out. As long as the drug trade is completely illegal, it will continue to be true what one journalist wrote not so long ago, and I quote, "More people die every year as a result of the war against drugs than die from what we call generally overdosing." Those people die in a number of ways. Some die in botched robberies as people who are severely addicted try very hard to scrape together the money that they need to feed their habit. Others die in police overaction. Others die in gang activity. This journalist referred to our drug prohibition as, quote, "the legal equivalent of a My Lai massacre," end quote. That journalist was William F. Buckley, founder of the National Review. Under a free market system, heroin would cost $20 a week rather than the $1,000 a week that it costs today. That is not an excuse for absolute license. That is an opening into rehabilitation, work, family reintegration, instead of spending every week as a drug addict trying to find $1,000 to get by on the next hit. Yes, drugs are extremely dangerous. Millions of people are addicted to them today after 40 years of failed prohibition efforts. It is time to open our eyes and give people something better to look forward to than a jail cell.
Thank you. At this point, Cato gets 1 minute for rebuttal.
Thank you. So our opponents talked about how if we talk about why the drug war is bad and all of the harms that come from it, that's a practical matter, and we shouldn't really discuss it. We should only talk in principle. But wasn't it their introduction that said that we should really focus on practically how our conservative principles work in the world and why libertarian principles are so impractical because they've never been tried? Prohibition has been tried, and as you admitted, it failed. And as my partner Matt just showed, it produces a lot of societal harm. Now, to preempt an argument that tries to argue the counterfactual, that says that without prohibition of drugs, we would have rampant drug use and more death in this country, we point to the case study of Portugal, where they have decriminalized all drugs. effectively not enforcing drug laws for purchasing drugs. The incidence of drug use for 14 to 19-year-olds has decreased. Heroin addiction has decreased. Incidence of AIDS and HIV from heroin use have decreased. Thank you.
Final on this topic, Heritage, 1 minute for rebuttal.
Thank you. I'm excited to see that we did walk down the very path we shouldn't have. That's always exciting to see us walk down another rehashed argument against the war on drugs. And I think we can spend more time, if we had more than 2 minutes and 1 minute, talking about the intricacies of the failure of the current war on drugs. But I'd like to address a couple of the points that I just found a little bit absurd. My opponents kind of cite the idea that heroin would cost $20 a week. That's a fairly accurate price, I suppose. But yet that this open added money would allow for rehabilitation. Is money the only thing that's separating heroin addicts from rehabilitation? Is money the only thing separating meth addicts from rehabilitation? Are we really going to live in this false belief that hard drugs that have been scientifically shown to cause insane amounts of addiction, can be overcome by simple rehabilitation clinic visits? I think we really need to address this idea that they do, in fact, curb liberty and the fact that they create an enormous amount of addiction. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to make a last word on the drug issue, which is I remember two libertarians once having a purity fight. I don't know if you guys have encountered those. And the question that one posed was, should toddlers be allowed to buy heroin from vending machines on a public sidewalk? The answer is obvious, which is that there should not be public sidewalks. What's a punchline for some people is an applause line for others. Topic number 2. This one will go Cato, Heritage, Heritage, Cato, and the resolution is that the defense budget should be cut. So, Cato, 2 minutes.
Thank you. We believe in peace, but we are not pacifists. When national defense requires that we serve our country, we serve our country. However, what we currently have is not a defense budget, but rather a military budget, because we don't spend money only on defense, we spend it on other unnecessary things. We propose cutting waste by not intervening in foreign conflicts that don't help protect our security. We propose not investing in fanciful and unnecessary equipment, but giving our boys and women the equipment that they need to be protected. We also propose that we should lower the national debt, which is our greatest security risk of late. Since 2002, $2.4 trillion and 4,486 American lives were sent to Iraq to never return. We endangered our own security in the process. Our invasion directly led to the regional dominance of Iran. The new prime minister of Iraq, Nouri al-Maliki, is backed by Tehran. We let American soldiers die in Iraq because we failed to give them body armor, up-armored vehicles, something as basic as desert print camouflage. What did we give them? The V-22 Osprey, a helicopter that costs twice as much as a Chinook helicopter. The Chinook helicopter carries more payload and is more reliable. Spending tax dollars on defense contract profits and not our own soldiers has endangered our security. National debt is now 97% of GDP. Let's look at the defense budget over history. From 1981 to 1989, we spent only $428.6 billion. That was at the height of the Cold War, which we won. From 2001 to 2011, we spent $505 billion. Why are we spending more today? The deficit, said Admiral Mike Mullen, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, is our greatest national security risk. Let's reduce that, and let's reduce the risk.
Thank you. Arguing in the negative, 2 minutes, Heritage.
I think to a certain extent we're actually going to find a little bit of agreement, and that I think we both agree that there is room in the budget to cut wasteful defense spending. I think where we're going to disagree, unsurprisingly, is what waste is. I think I'd kind of like to talk first about the emerging threats in the world that we are facing and the extent to which they do demand our full attention and our full commitment of resources. We see a burgeoning Iran. We see, at the same time, an unstable North Korea. We see the growth of unconventional threats against the mainland United States that require research into what my opponent called fanciful technologies. We see new cybersecurity threats every day. We see new threats of biological warfare every day. And what was once a fanciful idea for research may one day become the very idea that allows us to save hundreds, if not thousands, of lives. And so to dismiss out hand the idea that we should spend money on future technologies isn't a prudent, to use a word I'm sure we'll repeat many times tonight, isn't a prudent use of American dollars, unless we really need those technologies. My opponent cites a Chinook helicopter and compares it to the Osprey. I'm kind of a military enthusiast, at least from a technology standpoint, so I have to offer a minor correction in the sense that the Osprey, while it could contain fewer troops, can also transport them at twice the speed. That's kind of a minor detail here, but the point remains that these are technologies that we can use to improve our ability to transport soldiers and can actually be helpful. I mean, obviously, we disagree overall on the goal of American foreign policy and what constitutes there. I think we also need to recognize that defense spending is currently about 4% of GDP. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, 10%. We want to make cuts, which I think we do want to make cuts to reduce the deficit. Let's start there, and let's not cut to defense. We make mistakes with defense spending, it hurts us much, much worse in the long run. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, 1 minute for rebuttal, Heritage.
Yes, I think Keith addressed most of the important points that were brought up by Cato, but I'd like to point out one other thing that, again, we need to keep in mind that the goal of the military is to serve America's foreign interests, and sometimes America's foreign interest manifests itself in global involvement. For example, in the case of Iraq, which you brought up, we had very credible evidence as to the existence of WMD threats. We had a very good reason to go in there, and we went in there on the basis of American interests. We did not go in there for any other reason. Moreover, you make it sound like the national defense budget is this ginormous thing that if we could just get down a little bit more, we would suddenly, have a balanced budget. In fact, if we lower the defense budget, it will make it our lowest national priority, and that's just not acceptable.
Thank you. 1 minute for rebuttal. Cato.
If we had very credible evidence of Iraq, I shudder to think at how soon we'll be in Iran, to be honest. Here's your non-defense spending, which I would refer to as waste in the context of defense spending. There are 24 countries around the world with over 1,000 American troops in them. There are more American troops in countries that haven't seen combat in decades than there are in Afghanistan, which is another place that, frankly, we don't need to be. At this point, we are the functional national army of Iceland and Japan. We are the front line of defense in South Korea. New threats. North Korea is 1950 conventional with a cold med addiction. We believe in national security. We believe in global security. We think that it needs to be a shared responsibility among different countries. The more that America foots the bill, the more that our allies pare back and spend all their money socializing their economy while rogue nations arm. We believe that if we pare back, our allies will have plenty of reason to go ahead and arm, and that they will feel encouraged to monitor regional security, as the economic community of the West African states did when they intervened in Sierra Leone.
Time is up. Thank you. So that's defense. Thank you. Topic number 3, the resolution is that individuals should be free to move across borders, across the United States border. This will go Heritage, Cato, Cato, Heritage. So 2 minutes on the border.
Thank you. And considering the issue of whether individuals should be free to move across the U.S. border as they please, there's no doubt about the fact that this sounds like a nice thing to do, but the fact is that it does not work, and it will undermine American interests. Let's look at some of the people who are coming into this country illegally as it is. There are currently 12 million illegal immigrants in the United States. Those are 12 million people that are here against our wishes and without our knowledge about them. Moreover, more concerning is the fact that 1 in 4 inmates in federal prisons is an illegal immigrant. Again, people who have become a threat in our country who have crossed the border illegally. These are people who use our healthcare system, our education, etc., all of our vital services without paying an income tax and contributing into our national economy. Even more concerning is the issue of border security. If we have an open border with unrestricted access to this country, Think about the violence that is already going on the Mexican border with the drug cartel war. How much more of that is going to lap up onto our shores if we don't have any sort of immigration enforcement in that area? And furthermore, there's the ever-present threat of terrorists using our already porous border to smuggle weapons and warriors into our country. Imagine how much worse that is if there is absolutely no restriction on our border security. This is not to suggest that conservatives do not like immigration. We actually think immigrants are extremely important to this country. We consider them a vital part of American society. We argue that you need to streamline the visa process and improve temporary worker programs to make this country more accessible. However, we have a right to determine who crosses our border and to know who is in this country for the sake of American interests. We're not here to let anybody in without being able to determine who they are. So we absolutely have to have border security. The idea of an unrestricted access to America is just not feasible.
Thank you. 2 minutes from Cato.
Thank you. I think this is another one of those issues where we actually share some common ground. It's really a matter of what we're prioritizing. So to share a priority that we really value, I'd like to quote an important person. He said, "An immigrant can live in France but not become a Frenchman. He can live in Japan but not become Japanese. But anyone can come to America and become an American." The person who said that was former President Ronald Reagan. I think that we should keep Ronald Reagan's ideal in this instance alive. America, as our friends at Heritage noted, is a nation of immigrants. The first immigrants came here for the same reason that all subsequent immigrants did, to make money and live in freedom. We think those are two good things that we want to let these people do. It's no accident that the greatest waves of immigration in American history coincided with the periods of greatest economic growth in U.S. history. From 1878 to 1882, the economy grew by 40%. And from 1882 to 1892, it grew by another 49%. This is known as the Great Wave of Immigration. During that time period, unskilled labor was in demand, and we wisely let it in. Today, skilled labor is in high demand, yet we foolishly tell the best and brightest to get out. U.S. Immigration Services said we reached our cap of H-1B visas. The people who employ the majority of H-1B visas are Microsoft, IBM, and Infosys, still the most vibrant sector of our economy. In 2005, immigrant-led companies produced $52 billion worth of sales, added 450,000 jobs to the U.S. economy. 40% of Fortune 500 companies are run by first-generation and second-generation immigrants. Many of these people were educated in the U.S., and yet they're told to leave. This is being known as the reverse brain drain. This is something we want to limit, and we argue to regularize immigration so as not to have security threats. Thank you.
Thank you. 1 minute of rebuttal from Cato.
Border security is absolutely essential. We have 12 million people here. We have no idea if they have criminal records, if they have terrorist intents, and we need to be aware of who is in this country. Nobody willfully, for good reasons, comes across this border through the desert, comes over in the Rio Grande in the middle of the night in an inner tube. Nobody comes here on a leaky raft from the Caribbean if they have the choice. People go through those means and avoid the eyes of law enforcement because we have artificial caps on immigration. We only allow 500,000 people into this country every year legally. There is no line to get to the back of. You either have to have a white-collar degree or a relative who's legally here to come through legal means. If we remove those artificial caps and allow people to come in through normal channels, we can monitor our borders much more effectively. We will know that anybody who's coming in through covert means has ill intent, and we can put efficient checks on to make sure that the people who are coming into this country are people who we would like to be here.
Thank you. Now a minute for rebuttal from Heritage.
I think it's nice to see that there is an issue where we actually have quite a bit of agreement on, in the sense that we do also, like Cato, support the idea of having more immigrants here. We want to streamline the visa process. We want to make it easier for people, especially high-skilled workers like you mentioned, to come across the border and to be able to contribute to our economy. We think that's a wonderful thing. What we're most concerned about is, again, the people who are coming here illegally. The question, the resolution poses whether individuals should be free to move across the U.S. border. I think we can find common ground in saying that people should be able, we should streamline and make it easier to come across the U.S. border, but not that everybody should be able to come in and that there should be absolute free and unrestricted movement. So ultimately, I think in a lot of ways, as long as security comes first and that as long as we are able to regulate and determine who is able to access our system for U.S. interests, I think this is an area where we can, as I said, find a lot of common ground.
Thank you. So that's it for immigration. The final question is, the final resolution is, government has a role in promoting virtue. So Cato will go first on this one. 2 minutes.
Well, according to Aristotle, virtue is the end of the law, and I'm certainly not one to pick a bone with Aristotle. In adults, Aristotle points out, virtue is best formed through habits, not just instruction. People don't just need to be told what's good, they need to feel it. Conservatives agree. We believe that on welfare issues and on bailouts, that these programs breed dependency. They remove responsibility. They make it so that people rely on the government rather than on hard work. We would invite conservatives to extend that logic to entitlement programs, to Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. We believe that these programs undermine important virtues like family responsibility, good financial planning, and charity. We would also invite conservatives to extend Aristotle's principle that law only really promotes virtue when it's respected. Conservatives, at least a good number of conservatives, support some laws that are not easily respectable. One is our current drug prohibition. There are a lot of people who don't respect those laws, if only because of their impact on families and communities, not necessarily because people are just waiting to do cocaine. However, when we have the Supreme Court being forced to review a case of a 13-year-old strip-searched in her middle school because she was accused of possessing one ibuprofen tablet, we think that those laws inspire a lot more disdain for the law than respect for it. Indeed, we would look at something like the rise of gangster rap and songs like Cop Killer hitting the top of the charts a few years ago as a sign that law is just not commanding the respect that it ought to. National security is another area where this is the case. When people feel like they're constantly being watched, or like the Transportation Security Administration is going to take a special look at grandma through some X-ray glasses, we don't respect the law. What we need are laws that respect and support people's liberty, that conform to prudence and reason so that they do foster virtue. We need those laws to be local so that people feel like they have a stake of ownership in them, and we need laws that respect people's ability to live their lives relatively unencumbered unless there are very strong reasons for interfering.
Thank you. Now 2 minutes from Heritage.
So in addressing an issue like whether or not the government has a role in defining virtue, we're dealing with a very obviously delicate and complexly interrelated issue. John Adams said that our Constitution was made only for moral people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. Without virtue, then, as our founders knew, there can be no liberty, only temporary license. This is something that we hold to be very, very important, the role of virtue in a functioning democracy and in a functioning society. However, where this becomes complicated is the fact that we very, very much also believe that the government cannot impose virtue. That's what the statists seek to do through the welfare state, as was brought up, which we would also very much oppose. Affirmative action, radical environmentalism, any number of things are places where the government has sought to impose its virtues and its sense of values upon us. What we believe that the government can and should do is to encourage the institutions that do create virtue, therefore allowing this most important aspect of liberty to arise organically from the bottom up, from the people themselves. That means that the government has a role in supporting and in allowing and in promoting in religious institutions such as Catholic charities, the presence of chaplains in the military, and of course the family, supporting marriage through changing, for example, when we have a welfare code that seeks to discourage marriage. We believe that that's absolutely wrong and immoral. We do not believe that the government should impose its virtues upon us or impose any sense of religion or values upon the people. However, we do believe that it should allow those institutions that do promote a virtuous society to thrive and flourish and get out of their way and interfere with them in order to make sure that we are a civilization that can function in liberty successfully.
Thank you. Now, rebutting those for the Cato comments for 1 minute.
Sure, thank you. I'd like to kind of agree with my partner for a moment, but I'd like to draw a further delineation between the promotion of virtue and the codification of virtue. I don't think the law ought to be a vehicle for the codification of what is virtuous and what is not virtuous. I agree with my partner in the sense that we do absolutely need to have a law that promotes institutions that do encourage virtue, and there's a fine difference. I think both libertarians and conservatives would agree that law that attempts to tell you what is virtuous and what is not virtuous is not law that can be respected, and thus law that will not be followed. My opponent cites many of the same examples that I would encourage. I mean, again, we have the welfare state, and that's a problem. I don't think we need to eliminate those institutions in their entirety. I think we need to reform them and make them what they were intended to be, a kind of safety net. But at the same time, this does not invalidate the very simple idea that the government can successfully promote virtue via virtuous institutions. Not by law, but by virtuous institutions. Thank you.
Thank you. And the final rebuttal on this topic, 1 minute, Cato.
Thank you. It's really interesting to see that we agree that the government shouldn't compel virtue, and we also certainly agree that virtue is extremely important, especially in our republican system. It's a republic if you can keep it. But what I'd like to say is that we fundamentally disagree on the idea that the government can promote virtue. You talked about how the welfare code actually punishes marriage. We see those things all the time. We think that it's inherent in bureaucracy that it will do these very counterproductive things that actually stimulate virtue. So we'd also like to talk about another point you brought up, which is religion, something we think is very fascinating. We want it to thrive. If you love it, set it free, as we said. It's interesting that the United States has the most devout religious population in the Western world, yet no history of national religion. In places that do have histories of national religion, such as Sweden, the Swedish Evangelical Lutheran Church asked to be disestablished because its relationship with the government left pews empty. The same empty pews we see all throughout Western Europe.
Time. Thank you. That was round number 2 on all of the specific policy issues. So the third round is a simple question put to one speaker on each side. This is the moment of evangelization here. Why should a libertarian be a conservative? That's a question to Heritage.
Okay, well, we spent a great deal of time here tonight focusing on areas where we disagree, from drug policy to defense spending. We've clearly highlighted many areas where our opinions diverge, but conservatives and libertarians often don't take enough time to recognize the ways in which our different philosophies intersect. As I said in my opening remarks, we are natural allies, and I think we've had a chance to get a glimpse of some of the ways where that works so well tonight. In our current political climate, of increasing statism, it's ever more important that we recognize and embrace our similarities. We both value liberty, for starters, and we both share a common zeal for limited government and the individual. Even where we differ in the abstract, we often agree in practice. Prudence, an idea venerated by conservatives and that sometimes has been castigated by libertarians, even finds root in both of our philosophies. Look at our debates this evening. On virtually every topic that we discuss, some portion was devoted to the wealth of experience and lessons throughout human history, from looking at the role of prohibition in our current drug policy to our introductory remarks, which both reference James Madison. Despite exhortations to the contrary, libertarians recognize that the events of the past ought to have a bearing on our policy for the future. In other words, prudence has a role in our debate, whether libertarian or conservative. Do we disagree on what prudence calls for? Absolutely. And part of this can be attributed to differing understandings of human nature. But these disagreements still belong under the intellectual construct of conservatism. In truth, we are not so intellectually rigid as others would have you believe. Within our ranks, you can find Burkeans, Kirkians, Lockeans, and yes, in fact, libertarians. While we sometimes disagree on certain issues, we all share a common cause in the defense of ordered liberty. If you believe that liberty and order can coexist, if you believe that government should be structured according to the realities of human nature and human society, if you believe that at times liberty itself may have to be checked if it is to be maintained, even if you disagree with exactly where we draw that line, then you belong with conservatism, and you would be welcomed.
Thank you. So I ask you guys, why should a conservative be a libertarian?
When Russell Kirk, that great chronicler of the conservative mind, was born in 1918, there was a political ideology that, like modern conservatism, favored centralized national power, extensive military involvement overseas, and imprisoning people on public health grounds in the form of prohibition. It was called progressivism. Kirk was not terribly impressed with libertarians during his lifetime. He referred to them as chirping sectaries. But I think his ideas have helped to push me to this side of the panel rather than that one. Kirk talked about 6 canons of conservatism, and 3 were especially helpful in helping me to identify as a libertarian. The first is a belief in a transcendent order of natural law and tradition. The GOP these days, right down to Chief Justice Roberts' awful opinion last month, insists on judicial restraint, believing that it's the job of democracy and of popular passions to drive the scope of government. Libertarians, on the other hand, insist that even democracy must answer to our fundamental Constitution and to the ideas that it embodies. The second major canon that Kirk described was an affection for the variety and mystery of life. Many conservatives today support comprehensive federal legislation on narcotics, school testing standards, and religion. Libertarians, meanwhile, support peaceful local discussion by free people who are pursuing happiness throughout this great land. We believe that when people have the space to do so, they will find a large degree of comfort in the variety and mystery of life. Will find that they can band together with other people in civil association and find great meaning and indeed great happiness. The third major Kirkian canon that has influenced me is the idea that all innovation must be tied to customs and to prudence. Conservatives today continue to support naive wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and Syria, insisting that American arms can make gardens in the desert and somehow spread freedom through coercion. That's not the role of a prudent military, which ought to be focused on defending our great country. It also disregards customs in these places, which aren't necessarily ready for democratic liberty, or which must grow organically to come to favor it. Libertarians on these and so many other issues urge caution and humility. That's the real conservative approach. Conservatives should be open to libertarianism for the sake of conserving our constitutional order, our free nation, and our heritage of peace. The experience of certainly the last 12 years, if not the last century, has taught us very clearly that liberty is what conserves what's best about America and our life together. Thank you.
Thank you. So now, ladies and gentlemen, we move on to the question and answer period. A couple quick comments. It is a question and answer period. It's not a speech and answer period. So this is, we're at the risk of sounding slightly obnoxious here. Your fine judgment in coming here tonight proves to everybody your intelligence. Your question is not your opportunity to try to prove to the rest of the room your intelligence. We take that for granted. When I will call on people, please wait to be called on. Wait till the microphone comes. That is crucial so that everybody in the room, and especially everybody not in the room watching this, gets to hear your question. And we also would like you to announce your name and your affiliation. Keep the questions brief. Up here, each side will have about 1 minute to answer the questions, and on each side, and we'll try to get through as many questions as possible. So first, there's a question in the back, and again, the microphone will come to you. These guys are fast. So name and affiliation and brief question. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Clint Townsend. I'm with Students for Liberty. This question is for Heritage. I'm wondering how you defend against the claim that your positions on immigration are simply grounded in xenophobic jingoism, given that conservatism claims to advocate free trade. Don't benefits of free trade apply equally to goods and services? And I'm also unaware of any peer-reviewed economic studies that would support your views. Reagan, Bush, and McCain all support liberalized immigration.
All right. Thank you. Heritage first.
Sure. No, I'd love to talk about that a little bit. You know, you bring up free trade and goods and services, but I think we want to draw a delineation between the free trade of goods and services and the free trade of people. there's a very fine line we need to draw when it comes to what constitutes citizenship in the United States and who we allow into our country. It's not an extension of xenophobia. It's just simply a matter of we don't want to establish a dual class of citizenry in which we have some people in America who have the full benefits of American citizenship and some here who are just working and trying to reap a living. There create serious problems about that. If you look historically, that's one of the biggest issues during the fall of the Roman Republic and eventually the fall of the Roman Empire. There was a separation in that you had some people who had Roman citizenship and some people who didn't. And we want to avoid that. So really, it's a practical concern. I wouldn't at all characterize it as you did, and I would be very careful in using the term free trade to open up open borders in terms of the flow of people.
Thank you. Cato, you guys have 1 minute to address this.
First, I'd like to say that I don't appreciate the kind of personal attack that you just leveled on these folks. You don't know them, and to use two extremely loaded terms. Right out. So, just to respond briefly to the notion that we don't necessarily want two classes of people in America, we've always had procedures for assimilation in this country. That's been a normal part of the American experience to allow naturalization after a period of time. Libertarians certainly aren't interested in granting immediate voting rights to everybody who comes here. We do believe, however, that certainly if folks want to come here and have the opportunity to work and feel like it's economically viable and want to plant their families here, they're more than welcome to. We've seen that immigration is somewhat self-regulating. Folks indeed did leave this country when the recession hit, and we think that there's a pretty decent natural flow that happens there.
Thank you. All right, next question. Let's go in the back over there. And again, please state your name, your affiliation, and a brief question. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Laura D'Agostino, and last spring I interned with the American Enterprise Institute. My question is directed towards the Heritage Foundation, but I would really love any input from Cato as well. Concerning the topic of defense spending, I think one of the major issues is with the corporations of KBR and Halliburton foregoing the free market and securing contracts, not necessarily in a competitive way. How would you recommend that we could address the revolving door policies of politicians coming from these corporations and then going to Washington and securing these contracts without necessarily considering conserving money and what's best for our country?
Thank you. So you guys got asked at Heritage, go first.
Yeah, sure. It's an interesting question because I feel like that's you're kind of asking me, do I have a solution to government corruption? And the answer is I don't. If I did, I certainly wouldn't be here. I'd be trying to implement it somewhere, I hope. It's a serious problem. It's not just military contracts. It extends to a broad range of government services. It's a problem that plagues defense and other issues.
Yeah, I would just briefly add that that's definitely something that we're not going to sit here and support. We don't support that. We would definitely argue that there are places within the military that where efficiency could be enhanced and increased competition for lower prices and, more importantly, for better quality services as well is important. So we're not arguing that we should have a corrupt political system.
All right, Cato.
You know, that's a healthy question in a democracy, and I think one of the answers to your question is have people like you ask it yourself. We encourage competition as close to free market principles as you could possibly get when you're dealing with essential services. And like our friends at Heritage, I don't have a white paper to hand you right now on how to reduce that.
I would just say that I think rules are better than taking the left's approach of trying to knock out all these relationships and track them. They'll just wind up in darker back rooms. I think the better answer is just to set up clear rules that we're going to put these kinds of contracts out to bid. But I'm certainly no expert on this, and I commend you if you take some research down that road and try to give us a better answer, to be honest.
All right, thank you. Another question. Let's go further up here on the right. Whitish jacket, yeah.
Hi, Mackenzie Snow, Cato Institute. The question is for the Heritage Foundation. Heritage. You mentioned that we agree that government should not implement virtue. However, you mentioned that government should encourage institutions that do. If government support institutions, what distinguishes them from being government entities, and therefore, do they lose their independence and credibility?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we would say absolutely not. We believe, as I gave some examples in the opening speech, that, for example, I talked about like Catholic charities being allowed to flourish. chaplains in the military, things like that. Government should not give extra support to any one single religion. They should just support the institution of religion as a whole, and mostly get out of it and allow it to thrive, but not in any way inhibit it. So, for example, not stopping chaplains from serving members of the military because they see that as government, government supporting or government promoting and favoring a certain religion. So we just want to make sure that all religions have a place to flourish independently. Do you have anything to add? No?
All right, Cato.
We're a little bit concerned that control follows money. We think that given that Democrats will indeed eventually take control of the government, and indeed they have it right now, the more that the government is involved with religious organizations and whatnot, the more that they'll put restrictions on them. The Supreme Court upheld a public college requiring all student groups, including religious organizations that received official recognition, to take all comers as possible leaders. That meant that a Christian group had to take non-believers as leaders of their organization, and not necessarily just limited to that, but that means that gay groups could be forced to have evangelical leaders. We're concerned that there's the potential for a lot of takeover and that the government has other priorities, as we've seen of late. If government feels like something's within its reach, Kathleen Sebelius will go for it.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to now ask a favor. Does anyone have a question that's more targeted at Cato? Because we've just gotten 3 in a row. All right, up here in front.
Luca Gattonicelli, Competitive Enterprise Institute, and I'm a libertarian, but here I am, living in the real world. I have a question for Cato. What role, and I'd love to hear your thoughts too. You guys have both represented yourselves really well. Congratulations. I would like to know what role, if any, you see for the government in the definition of the institution of marriage.
That's a good question. It was one of our potential topics. And again, I just want to avoid any personal attacks if any of these things could be perceived as them. So we believe that marriage has historically been individually defined. Now, what this means is not simply that individuals say they're married and then there's no institutional support. It means that the natural institutions that have developed over time, such as churches, other religious institutions, communities themselves, marriage is a bond that you take in front of other people. And it wasn't until the progressive era in this country that there actually was a state definition of marriage. So, and we have precedent for the idea that individuals can say, we are married, we cohabitate, we are consenting adults wishing to marry one other consenting adult, and the states recognize this with common law marriage. The federal government has applied a system where you can simply sign an affidavit that says that you should be considered married, you want to accept, or in a union together, you want to accept the responsibilities for that, and that's a very simple and legitimate use there.
Thank you.
Sure, no, that's a very interesting question. I think at its core, marriage is a social institution. I think we both touched on that a little bit. And when I see the current action of the federal government, I see nothing more than a state incentivizing one social institution over another. I think we would both oppose laws that would prohibit the ability of two individuals to live together. I think that is not an issue on the table here. But at its core, the idea that we have a system, whether by tax breaks or other incentives that encourages one social institution over another, there's nothing inherently wrong with that practice. And I think the push behind conservative thinking is the idea that the traditional understanding of marriage provides the greatest amount of benefit to society. So at the end of the day, I think the federal government can have an idea or a role in the definition of marriage insofar as it has a right to incentivize what it wants to incentivize, provided that it does not put other groups at an incredibly inherent disadvantage. So I think that the current system, as it's articulated, kind of best exemplifies the conservative view.
All right, thank you. All right, another question over here on this side, second row. Hi.
Ryan Mulvey, Cato Institute Center for Constitutional Studies. This is particularly directed at Cato. It's typically a libertarian position that the role of the courts in our country is to be engaged and to actively preserve the liberties of the people, including those which may not be explicitly enumerated in the Constitution. What is the check on the power of the courts in exercising this sort of engagement?
All right.
The check, as James Madison pointed out, is that the judiciary is inherently the weakest branch. It doesn't have any money of its own. It doesn't have a police force it can send out. It's not the executive. It's not the legislative. All that it can do is put forward what it believes are consistent intellectual principles. I think that is an inherent limitation on its reach over society, at least when it's appropriately exercised, and the simple fact that the other branches can do things to it when they disagree, I think is a pretty decent check. The 1960s and 70s role of judicial activism, where judges seems to just take what they really believed on policy grounds or the best ideas and put them into law, I think that was absurd. I think, though, that the conservative response of pure judicial restraint and of an unwillingness to let the judiciary say that Congress has certain limits it can't pass, and that Congress gets a strong presumption that everything that it does is completely in line with public interests, and that Congress gets to define the role, the scope of the federal government. I think that's ludicrous. I don't think that's at all what the founders had in mind.
All right. Thank you. Time. Heritage.
Sure. Well, first of all, I think we disagree on what judicial restraint is. I don't think judicial restraint is anything close to what Justice Roberts exercised just a few weeks ago. I think judicial restraint pertains to a reading of the Constitution, and in particular, a reading that's closest to originalism, I guess, is what I'm advocating for here. But just the idea, more responding to your question, that, you mentioned most of it. It's the weakest branch, one. Two, there are ways to amend the Constitution to alter interpretation. I mean, that's been done before. Laws have been changed before in particular responses to judicial rulings. So on the whole, I think you answered most of it. We still do disagree on what judicial restraint is, and if I had more than a minute, there might be more time to discuss that. But on the whole, I think both of us have kind of answered it pretty completely.
All right, another question. Smack in the middle. Is that a pink shirt you're wearing there? Yeah, pink shirt guy. So you can give your actual name and affiliation.
My name's Nick. Nick with AI. My question is for Heritage. I think it's easy enough to argue against drug legalization without defining drugs, and I think the burden of proof lies with you, just advocating the imprisonment of more people. So I would ask you to, talking about drugs, to give a definition of what you mean by drug when you say certain drugs should be illegal, and some sort of standard by which somebody, I don't know who you think should determine this, but some sort of standard by which drugs should be deemed legal or illegal.
So I have 1 minute to define drugs. Would you like to start? Or?
We was more or less adhere with the pretty common definition of what constitutes an illegal drug. It's the addictive substances that are currently defined as being illegal. We're not going to try to define alcohol or tobacco or anything like that. Things like marijuana, heroin, cocaine, or marijuana. That too. That's bad. We shouldn't have that. And we're sticking to a very conventional definition of what should be illegal. And as far as who should determine that, I mean, it's a legal question, and
it's why we have representative government.
Yes.
I mean, that has to be part of it.
Yes.
All right, Cato.
Sure. There's certainly room for re-looking at what the current definitions are that our representative government has given us. Marijuana is a Schedule I drug. Codeine is less severe according to the federal government's definitions. I think these definitions that don't reflect current medical science are part of the problem in having laws that don't reflect the real need for prohibition in our society.
These definitions also aren't usually passed by the representative government. They're passed by an agency, the Food and Drug Administration, which is part of the executive branch, and there's a bit of a problem in political accountability there, especially when the federal government a few years back went all the way to the Supreme Court trying to deport a man who was a permanent resident, had lived here since he was 5, and his second offense was having one unprescribed Xanax tablet, which is a fairly common anti-anxiety med. This isn't nearly representative enough to the extent that we're going to restrict substances like this.
All right, another question. Let's go back to the back, way back. Yeah, the guy who just looked over your shoulder. Yeah.
Hi, Anthony Hinnon, Sunshine Review. This one is aimed mostly at Heritage. William F. Buckley defined conservatism as standing athwart history, yelling stop. And F.A. Hayek, in his essay Why I Am Not a Conservative, criticized that view as saying it essentially has conservatism being pulled along by any other philosophy that's setting the agenda. So it's sort of there was a poll last month done by Dartmouth who polled Republicans asking who would be willing to cut Medicare, Medicaid, or Social Security. 12% of Republicans were for that. So my sort of point is,
hopefully this is a question.
Yeah,
not
sorry.
just a point, yeah.
Conservatism it talks about limited government, but when they keep getting pulled along, when does that limited government ideology actually kick in, rather than go along with current liberalism?
Heritage.
Sure. I'd kind of like to counter with a William F. Buckley quote that my partner's already cited, that conservatism is a politics of reality. This is mostly in a response to that second poll you cited. I do think principles of limited government kick in. I think we just also recognize that it is not realistic or prudent to exercise them to the fullest extent in the immediate future. It's just a serious question. I mean, too much change in a society can destroy it. History is a perfect example of that. I mean, how many societies have undergone rapid change and been utterly and completely demolished? What was the French Revolution if not a society that moved too quickly? So I think we need to consider that in answering that question. I disagree with Hayek. I don't think that conservatism simply is standing athwart history yelling stop, or Hayek, Buckley. I disagree with him there. And I take more of a fusionist approach. I think my partner does as well.
I'd just add that we absolutely do have policies that we would like to see changed in things like Medicare, Social Security. We would like to see Social Security made means tested at some point. However, we recognize that just simply pulling the plug and saying it's all over now is going to cause a collapse of the system and is going to do more harm than good.
Cato.
I'm still just a bit confused, and I do have conservative leanings, so I understand the tension, but that conservatism is the politics of reality, which has limited government principles and believes that we should moderately move towards them. I mean, that just sounds like a lot of things. I think it is wise to be prudent. I'm not sure that I would be wiping out the vast majority of the U.S. government tomorrow or overnight or anything. I just think that it's important to nail down firmer, clear ideas of where we're trying to go and to understand our relationship with reality more clearly in light of those, and to try to be agents of change, even if it's going to be more gradual.
All right, another question. Yes, right up front.
Lucy Steigerwald with Reason Magazine. This is for Heritage, but as usual, Cato, I want to see what you think. I hate to stress the drug war thing, but let's just say vice in general. I'm curious, Heritage, what, like, more concretely, I mean, you say you're sort of less keen on the drug war, at least with marijuana. Concretely, what do you think is the legitimate government reaction to vice, prostitution, pornography, all drugs? And also, you say that you're, in the real world, but particularly drugs have been done, for thousands of years. And obviously, we have a draconian drug policy now, and yet people still do drugs. So does that really go with the whole real world thing when you're trying to prohibit something that is clearly being done in spite of draconian laws?
Yeah, absolutely. We believe that when it comes to issues of vice and things like that, things that have absolutely no benefit to society, like prostitution and the legalization of hard drugs, that the government that can only do damage to society, the government does have a role to play in defining them and in objecting to them. And as far as your what you said about draconian drug laws having no effect on our national drug crisis, the fact of the matter is that drug use has gone down quite a bit since the 1980s, and so it is having an effect. We would like to see that trend continue rather than see drug use go up, which is inevitable. When you legalize something, the use of it goes up.
All right, Cato.
Mm-hmm. Of course, on the flip side of vice, there is virtue, and I think I'd like to reiterate the point that Matt brought up in the intro, which was so interesting, that was when you have laws that you can't respect, that doesn't promote virtue. So I think we should always be wary of generating these laws that are not respectable. And when we talk about virtue in a general sense, again, we default to the idea, which we think is a good idea, that the private people, because virtue is so valuable inherently, will pursue it. And that anything that gets in the way of people understanding why they are pursuing things, whether it's a government urging them to do it, it loses its inherent meaning, and we think that's a problem.
All right. We're going to have to move on to the next round, but actually I'm going to ask something it's kind of a follow-up to that question, but it surrounds a lot of these. And I'll start with Cato on this question. How would you describe sort of the different roles of the federal, state, and local government in any of these things, whether we're talking about vices or the promotion of virtue, any of these topics we've talked about, divide it up?
Sure. I know Matt will have some good comments on this as well. Federalism is extremely important. We have seen it work in both ways. There are scholars at Cato that think it was a great thing that the Supreme Court returned the right of marriage, which was perceived in the Constitution, to the people by overturning anti-miscegenation laws. There are other Cato scholars that think that because states are localized and make better laws that are more in keeping with what would spontaneously emerge in those communities anyway, that they should be given deference. I think both of these points are valid. I think we have a system of government made by very smart people, and I like it.
I don't have much to add to that. I think conservatives and libertarians largely agree that to the extent that decisions are made, they should be made at the federal at the most federalist level possible, and that we should have a system wherein the lowest branches of government do most of the heavy lifting in this country, which they certainly don't today. I suppose the one place to bring back judicial restraint a little bit, where local politics or state politics seems really to have been captured by special interests and seems to be doling out goodies, taking people's money and redistributing it to favored industries and businesses and whatnot. We tend to believe that the courts really ought to be engaged there, ought to exercise some good scrutiny, and ought not to let states take liberty without redress. But otherwise, I think you're going to be hearing a lot of the same things. I think things went already under President Bush, but I think a lot of conservatives and libertarians largely agree that these things are best left at local levels.
Yeah, no, I think we are going to have a lot of overlap. The simplest answer is just to look to the Constitution. I mean, that provides kind of the best guide for the delineation of these different powers, and that should be the foundation for any reasonable discussion about a lot of these issues. And fortunately, I think we've both spoken to a lot of that tonight, both Cato and Heritage has. I mean, there's really nothing more to add except, I mean, the Constitution is a pretty effective guide for that.
All right. So what we now have are the closing arguments. It's 4 minutes per side, and I just want to make sure I get this exactly right. Yes. Heritage, having gotten the first word and being the visiting team, is going to bat in the top of the ninth, and these guys get to bat in the bottom of the ninth. So just
do we have the podium or doing from here?
Do it from there.
Oh, sure. Well, before I begin officially, I would like to again thank the Cato Institute for being an incredible host. I'd like to thank the audience for being incredibly respectful and for asking.
Hey, incredibly respectful. Thank you. I'm going to stop the clock on that one. So, did I hit a light switch or something? No.
Maybe I shouldn't thank you guys too soon. Yeah. No, but I would like to thank you all for being such incredibly gracious hosts. I'd like to thank again the members of Heritage who helped us prep, as well as those who have put on such an incredible intern program, Heather and Angelis. I'd also like to give a special thanks to Shelby Tankersley, who played an incredible role in help coordinating our debate prep team. But in this conclusion, we've answered a lot of questions today. We do have a lot of disagreements, but at the same time, we do agree in a lot of areas as well. So instead of offering a question or an answer to end today's debate, I'd like to ask kind of a different question. And it's one that might clarify a couple more of our differences. But why is it that, to a large extent, libertarianism as a philosophy exists predominantly in America? In the sense that libertarianism as a distinct and ordered system exists predominantly in the United States. And the answer that I'd like to posit, the truth that I'd like to end this debate with, is that it exists predominantly in the United States because whether or not explicitly acknowledged, it relies upon the social capital of the Western tradition, very institutions that in some senses it decries. And the example that I like to give with this traditionally is North Korea. If North Korea were to dissolve tomorrow, what would happen? What would libertarians have us do? If we were to grant them complete and utter freedom under the, I guess complete and utter liberty would perhaps be a better word, what would happen? Would they be able to handle themselves? Or would their society likely crumble under the weight of complete and utter liberty? Even if we gave them the inherited social institutions that we have, they would maybe handle it for one generation, maybe two, but that too would eventually run into the ground. The complete freedom that libertarianism advocates relies inherently to some degree upon the very Western tradition it decries. And in a certain sense, the way I best love to describe libertarianism, and I mean this in the best possible way, is that it's a caricature of what I love about America. It sounds corny, it sounds ridiculous, but in a certain sense, that's what it is. It's that don't tread on me mentality, the idea that the government should stay as far away from the individual as possible. And in that sense, it's a very valuable idea. There's been enormous interplay between libertarians and conservatives over the past 100 years, and I want that to continue. Libertarians apply appropriate ideological pressure to the conservative movement when it's failed. But at the same sense, in the same time, conservatives also apply a pressure to perhaps reconcile the idea of liberty more so with reality, more so than libertarians would certainly want, but it's a reconciliation that needs to occur. And to that end, I think we've kind of come to a place where we must part. It is an interesting discussion. It's been a fantastic debate. But at its core, we simply have two different concrete understandings of what are required for liberty to thrive. I think there is more, and I think my conservative allies would agree that it's more than simple liberty itself. Order does need to exist. And sometimes the government must take steps to ensure that order. But liberty as an institution must be preserved. So again, I'd like to thank Cato. I'd like to thank everyone that attended here. And I appreciate the time to address all of you this evening.
Thank you. All right, concluding remarks from Cato.
Sure. We'd also like to thank everyone for being here and being a great audience. We'd like to thank the Heritage interns for coming here and being very gracious guests. It's hard to be on another team's home turf. So I like the tactic you took in asking another question. I myself have one, given the debate that's already taken place here. I'd like to point out on the question of virtue and the idea of having institutions that promote it. Now, what exactly is an institution of government that promotes virtue, yet does not compel virtue? And why is it that in the free market of commerce and goods, conservatives take the very reasonable, rational, and prudent approach, which is that we have the aim of a very productive economy, and we think that governments can't create jobs? That doesn't make sense. You guys aren't Keynesians when it comes to material. So why are you Keynesians when it comes to ideas? Don't the same natural laws apply to what makes people desire certain things in terms of values as in terms of material goods? So we really think that this divergence, you said, here's where we part. We think we part when it comes to faith faith is not a great term. It reflects what some libertarians think on this issue, or rather observed experience of the spontaneous order being able to generate an order itself. So I think that's an important point. As for the people that gave us these great ideas on spontaneous order, they weren't really American. Mises and Hayek represent the Austrian school, which has given us a great heritage of liberty and libertarianism. Also, we see today that a lot of these principles, especially emanating from Central Europe, we see them being implemented even more in Eastern Europe than they actually are in the US today. There's a great article that we had here about how Estonia has been practicing the free market principles that we both argue will help rehabilitate the economy here, and has been very effective with it. So I think what we should really ask is how we can give the rest of the world, which has given us liberty in a lot of philosophical ways, arrive at the same conclusions. And we talked about using military force in this discussion. We both seem to agree that the war in Iraq had disastrous consequences. Why we went there is something we disagree on, but we think certainly we didn't achieve what we went there to do. If that was to spread liberty, it hasn't happened. So we think that how to spread liberty throughout the world, engage in the same principles we value here: free exchange, trade, allowing people to come and go with obvious security measures. And we think that people spreading ideas, we can learn more together than we possibly could as individuals.
Thank you. I have a couple announcements I've been given here. There's a reception, which is just right out here, correct? It's on this floor. It's in the Winter Garden afterwards. If you need restrooms, they're down on the lower level. Turn left when you reach the bottom of the stairs. and they'll be down the hallway on your right. I want to say I thought this was an incredibly impressive debate and also stimulating. I hope it'll stimulate how you guys continue to think about it. I think the two clear winners are Alexander Hamilton and William F. Buckley, who edges out. Sorry, James Madison and Buckley, who edges him out just barely. But again, I think I want to thank the audience for your questions, the panelists for being so clear, so concise, and obeying the time limits. And I hope everyone here will give them a big round of applause. Thank you.